It was September 16, 2009 in Malibu, California, the kind of night when the ocean breeze carried a quiet stillness across the Pacific Coast Highway. But inside Jeffrey's, an upscale restaurant overlooking the water, something was wrong. Guests whispered as a 24-year-old woman spoke and moved with a disjointed, uneasy rhythm. That woman was Mitrice Richardson, vibrant, educated, and full of promise. Within hours, she would vanish into the California canyons, sparking one of the most controversial missing persons cases in recent history. Welcome to the Cold Case Archive, where we reopen the files of unsolved mysteries, forgotten victims, and cases still demanding answers. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that deserves to be remembered. On the surface, Malibu is a place that sells itself as paradise. The beaches stretch wide and golden. The Pacific shimmers under the fading sun. Hills and canyons frame a community known for luxury homes and celebrity hideaways. But Malibu also carries an undercurrent of isolation. Beyond the main strip of Pacific Coast Highway, the landscape twists into shadowy ravines and remote mountain roads. For those unfamiliar, the terrain can be unforgiving, beautiful at sunset but treacherous after dark. That contrast, wealth and wilderness, glamour and danger, formed the backdrop to Mitrice's final night. Before the headlines, before the controversy, Mitrice was simply a young woman with ambition. Born in 1985, she grew up in Los Angeles County, raised by her mother, Mitrice Sutton, and stepfather. Her father, Michael Richardson, remained a presence in her life as well. She was bright, athletic, and outgoing. Friends describe her as someone who lit up a room. She had a wide smile and a laugh that carried. She had studied psychology at Cal State Fullerton, graduating in 2008. Her dream was to work in clinical psychology, possibly even pursue a doctorate. At the time of her disappearance, she was living in South Los Angeles with her great-grandmother, a woman she adored and often helped care for. Mitrice wasn't just academically sharp, she was creative too. She had danced professionally and worked part-time as a go-go dancer, supplementing her income while pursuing her career goals. She loved to express herself, to challenge norms, and to stand out in her own way. But in the weeks leading up to September 2009, something in Mitrice's life had begun to shift. Family and friends noticed subtle changes. Moments of strange behavior, unusual comments, bursts of energy followed by disconnection. In hindsight, some believe she may have been experiencing the onset of a mental health crisis, possibly tied to bipolar disorder. At the time, however, those shifts were not yet fully understood. That night, Mitrice drove her 1998 Honda Civic from Los Angeles toward Malibu. The trip wasn't planned with anyone else, she went alone. She arrived at Jeffrey's Malibu, an upscale restaurant perched above the coastline, sometime in the evening. The restaurant is known for its sweeping views, celebrity clientele, and high-end seafood and cocktails. At first, staff and diners thought little of her presence. She was young, stylish, and composed, the kind of customer who fit right in with Malibu's eclectic mix of locals and visitors. But as the evening unfolded, her behavior drew attention. She joined a group of strangers at a table, engaging them as if they were old friends. She spoke in riddles, weaving references to her family and astrology, slipping between moments of clarity and moments that made little sense. Witnesses would later describe her as both charming and unsettling, as though she were caught between two worlds, one grounded, the other drifting. When her check arrived, around $89, Mitrice admitted she couldn't pay. She told staff that her mother nature would take care of it. At another point, she suggested she was being tested, that this moment had spiritual meaning. The staff were polite but concerned. It wasn't anger or defiance they saw in her, it was confusion, maybe even a cry for help. Restaurant employees followed procedure. At around 10 p.m., they called the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, reporting that a young woman couldn't pay her bill and was behaving strangely. Deputies from the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station, located about 10 miles inland, were dispatched. What's important here is that Jeffrey's employees weren't simply concerned about money. They later emphasized that they worried for Mitrice's safety. One of the restaurant managers even offered to pay her bill to avoid escalating the situation. But deputies insisted they had to respond formally. When the deputies arrived, they questioned Mitrice. They found a small amount of marijuana in her car, less than an ounce, and noted her unpaid meal. On that basis, they decided to take her into custody. For those in the restaurant, this was the last time they saw her alive. Some felt relief, thinking the authorities would ensure her safety. Others felt uneasy, watching her escorted away in the back of a patrol car. At that moment, the night could have taken a different path. A mental health evaluation, a release into the care of family, or simply waiting until morning might have kept her safe. Instead, Mitrice was driven inland, deeper into the Malibu canyons, toward the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station, a place that would become central to the controversy that followed. To picture the scene is to hold a contrast in your mind. Inside Jeffries, the air smelled of garlic butter and sea salt, couples toasted with fine wine, and laughter carried across candlelit tables. Outside, waves broke in steady rhythm against the cliffs. And amid it all, a young woman, brilliant, loved but unraveling, was quietly slipping away from the safety of ordinary life. This wasn't yet the disappearance. This wasn't yet the discovery. It was the last time Mitrice Richardson was seen in public before being taken into custody. Within hours, her fate would veer into darkness, leaving behind questions that remain unanswered to this day. The scene at Jeffries' Malibu that evening had shifted from curiosity to concern. The ocean breeze drifted through the open patio doors as dinner guests leaned in to whisper. At one table, Mitrice Richardson, bright-eyed, elegant, but clearly unsettled, continued speaking in fragmented phrases that made little sense to those around her. Some of her words carried a strange poetry. She spoke of the universe, of Mother Nature, and of signs that only she seemed able to read. At moments, she laughed softly to herself. At others, she stared into the distance as though her thoughts had already wandered far beyond the restaurant's walls. Waitstaff had tried gently to guide the situation. One server discreetly asked if Mitrice had a method of payment, but she offered vague responses, then shifted the conversation toward astrological patterns and destiny. When the $89 bill arrived, she could not produce a wallet, credit card, or cash. Patrons at nearby tables noticed her restlessness. The staff, trying to de-escalate, suggested she call a friend or family member to come assist. But her replies only deepened their worry. "I'm fine," she reportedly said. "I just know what the universe wants for me." As the evening stretched past 9 p.m., Mitrice wandered out toward the valet area, where she began examining cars that were not hers. According to witnesses, she peered inside windows, almost as if she were searching for something hidden, something only she knew was there. The valet attendants tried to redirect her, but her attention flickered. By now, her behavior could no longer be dismissed as simple eccentricity. It seemed clear that something was wrong. The manager, faced with a young woman unable to pay her bill, acting erratically and without a ride, felt compelled to call for law enforcement backup. He dialed the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and within minutes, deputies from the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station arrived. When deputies entered Jeffries, they found Mitrice seated again at a table, calm but distant. Her beauty and poise contrasted sharply with the confusion in her words. Asked about the unpaid bill, she offered little explanation beyond rambling statements about her destiny and about how her life was unfolding exactly as it should. Restaurant staff later recounted that they pleaded with deputies to let them pay the bill for her. They didn't want to see her arrested. But deputies declined the offer. Instead, they asked to search her Toyota Corolla parked nearby. Inside, they discovered a very small amount of marijuana, less than an ounce, technically a violation in 2009 though hardly a serious one. The combination of the unpaid bill and the marijuana provided a legal basis for an arrest. And so, shortly after 10 p.m., deputies placed Mitrice Richardson in handcuffs and escorted her into a patrol car. For bystanders, it was a troubling sight. Here was a young woman, clearly not herself, led away under arrest for what seemed like minor infractions. What no one knew at the time was that this would be the last evening Mitrice Richardson was seen alive by friends, family, or the public. The drive to the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station, located in Agora Hills just off the 101 freeway, took about 15 minutes. Once there, deputies booked her on 2 charges: defrauding an innkeeper, the unpaid restaurant bill, and possession of marijuana. They inventoried her belongings, her car keys, but no wallet, no phone, no cash. For all practical purposes, she had nothing with her that could guarantee her safety if she were released. Deputies noted her demeanor during booking. By some accounts, she was calm and cooperative. She answered questions politely. But her statements remained unusual, peppered with cosmic references, abstract thoughts, and moments that did not align with the context of her arrest. Some deputies later said she appeared stable enough and did not meet the criteria for a psychiatric hold under California law. Others, years later, would argue this interpretation ignored clear signs of a mental health crisis. Inside the station, Mitrice sat in the small holding area. Hours passed. Deputies rotated through, each forming their own impression of her condition. At one point, she reportedly sat quietly, at another she hummed softly to herself. Despite the strangeness of her behavior earlier at Jeffries, the booking log would later describe her as cooperative and not combative. Meanwhile, at home, Mitrice's mother, Mitrice Sutton, had been informed of the arrest. Alarmed, she called the station that night. In a later press conference, Mitrice described that phone call in painful detail. "I asked them to hold her until morning. I didn't want her released in the middle of the night with no money, no car, no phone. I was told she'd be safe. But by the time that assurance was given, the decision had already been made." At 12:30 a.m. on September 17, 2009, Mitrice Richardson was released from custody. She walked out of the Lost Hills Sheriff Station alone. No phone, no money, no transportation. Just the dark stretch of Agora Road behind her, surrounded by canyons, wilderness, and silence. The station's own log confirms her release. Deputies handed her back her keys, though her car had been impounded miles away in Malibu. There was no one waiting for her, no way to call for help. This decision, to release her in the dead of night in an isolated area, without the means to ensure her safety, has since become the most heavily scrutinized aspect of the case. Her family, community leaders, and countless advocates have questioned why deputies did not hold her until morning, or why they did not at least contact a family member before letting her go. The sheriff's department later defended their actions, claiming Mitrice appeared competent and in control of her faculties. But those who knew her best, her mother, her father, her friends, have never accepted that explanation. And this is where we ask you, our viewers, do you think the sheriff's department made the right call by following procedure, or should deputies have exercised greater judgment, knowing Mitrice had no means to protect herself that night? Let us know what you believe in the comments, because this decision would change everything. What happened after Mitrice stepped into the dark that night is where the story turns from troubling to tragic. Because within hours she would vanish into the canyons, sparking a search, a controversy, and a mystery that still echoes more than a decade later. She stepped out of the Lost Hills Sheriff Station just after midnight. The time was recorded in the log, 12:30 a.m., September 17, 2009. The building sat on Agora Road, surrounded not by city lights but by canyons, fields, and the long stretch of the 101 freeway in the distance. There were no taxis waiting, no buses running, no sidewalks bustling with people. Just darkness, quiet, and the faint hum of traffic far away. For a young woman without money, a phone, or transportation, it was one of the most dangerous places to be set free. Deputies had handed her the keys to her car, though the vehicle itself had been impounded miles away at Jeffries in Malibu. For all intents and purposes, Mitrice Richardson was stranded. What happened next has never been fully reconstructed, but evidence, and later witness reports, suggest a haunting path. In the hours immediately after her release, several local residents reported strange occurrences. Around 6:30 in the morning, Bill Smith, a resident of the Monte Nido neighborhood deep in Malibu Canyon, placed a call to the sheriff's department. He told dispatchers he had seen a young black woman sitting on his hillside property. She appeared disoriented, perhaps resting, perhaps waiting. When he stepped outside, she vanished into the brush. This sighting was just over 6 miles from the station, a daunting walk through dark, winding canyon roads. It suggested Mitrice had wandered into the wilderness, alone and unprepared. Search dogs brought to the area later that week traced a scent that seemed to confirm she had passed through the canyon, though the trail abruptly ended near creek beds and thick brush. For her family, the nightmare had already begun. Mitrice Sutton awoke to find her daughter had not returned home. She called the station again, demanding answers. She was told Mitrice had been released at 12:30 a.m. Mitrice's heart sank. She had pleaded with deputies not to let this happen. Now her daughter was gone, and no one could explain why she hadn't been held until morning. By midday, family members were canvassing the canyon areas themselves, calling her name, showing photos to anyone who might have seen her. Flyers were printed. Friends and relatives used their own cars to comb the rugged terrain. The sheriff's department initiated a search, but early efforts were limited. Deputies checked the Monte Nido neighborhood, followed up on the 6:30 a.m. sighting, and spoke to a few residents. But as the hours turned to days, Mitrice's trail seemed to evaporate into the wilderness. Her family refused to stay quiet. They held press conferences, speaking out against what they saw as negligence. They pointed out that Mitrice had been left vulnerable in the middle of the night, with every indicator of a mental health crisis and no resources to help her. She wasn't just another arrestee, her father, Michael Richardson, later said. She was my daughter. She needed help, not abandonment. The search quickly became a battle of perspectives. On one side, the sheriff's department maintained they had acted according to procedure. Deputies insisted Mitrice had appeared coherent, and that there was no legal basis to hold her against her will. On the other side, her family and supporters argued that deputies had ignored obvious red flags: erratic behavior at Jeffries, rambling speech, the lack of phone, money, or transportation. They insisted any reasonable officer should have recognized she was at risk. Community members rallied around the case. Activists organized vigils. Flyers appeared across Malibu, Calabasas, and Los Angeles, featuring Mitrice's smiling face and the date of her disappearance. The case struck a nerve, especially among Black residents who saw in Mitrice's story a familiar pattern of neglect, indifference, and lack of urgency from law enforcement when it came to missing persons of color. In the weeks that followed, search teams expanded their efforts. Mounted units, helicopters, and volunteers combed the rugged terrain of Malibu Canyon. At times, cadaver dogs were brought in. Searchers trekked through thick underbrush, scaled steep ridges, and examined creek beds where a person might seek water or shelter. But no sign of Mitrice emerged. As weeks turned to months, frustration deepened. The family demanded that the sheriff's department release surveillance footage from the station that might show Mitrice's behavior prior to release. For months, the department resisted, citing ongoing investigations. When the footage was finally released, it showed Mitrice in the station lobby, calm but distant, moving her arms in a subtle dance-like motion. For many, the video reinforced the idea that she was not in her right state of mind that night, and that deputies should never have let her walk out alone. What do you think? Should law enforcement have prioritized her safety over strict procedure? Or was their claim that she seemed competent enough to justify her release? Share your thoughts below. Meanwhile, her family continued their own search. They walked the canyon roads where she may have traveled. They knocked on doors. They consulted psychics, spoke to private investigators, and pressed media outlets to keep her name alive. For Mitrice, every day that passed felt like another opportunity slipping away. In January 2010, nearly 4 months after Mitrice vanished, the Los Angeles City Council authorized a $10,000 reward for information leading to her whereabouts. Billboards went up in Los Angeles. National outlets began covering the story. And yet, there were still no answers. Some locals speculated she may have sought shelter in the mountains, surviving for a time before succumbing to the elements. Others feared foul play, pointing out that the canyon roads were frequented by unsavory figures, and that Mitrice could have been picked up by the wrong person after leaving the station. For her parents, neither theory was acceptable. Both demanded accountability. I asked them to keep her safe, Mitrice said. They let her walk out into the dark. Now she's gone. The search would continue for months, but by summer 2010 the case had grown cold. Deputies scaled back their efforts. Flyers faded on telephone poles. But her family never stopped pressing, demanding that law enforcement treat the case with the urgency it deserved. And then, nearly a year later, a shocking discovery in a remote canyon would bring the case crashing back into the spotlight. The summer of 2010 unfolded under a heavy silence for those who had followed the story of Mitrice Richardson. Nearly a year had passed since she walked out of the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station in the middle of the night, alone, disoriented, and unprepared for the wilderness that surrounded her. Flyers that once carried her smiling face had begun to yellow on telephone poles, their edges curled by sun and weather. Reward money that once inspired hope remained untouched. Even the stream of tips that had fueled late-night calls to her family and detectives had dwindled to nothing. To many in the broader public, her disappearance had become just another entry in the long ledger of missing persons cases that slowly slip into obscurity. But for her family, the passage of time did not dull the urgency. Each day was another test of endurance, another round of phone calls, interviews, and prayers, as they clung to the fragile possibility that Mitrice was still alive. It was on August 9, 2010 that everything shifted. That morning began like countless others in Malibu Canyon, where steep ravines and tangled brush make up a wilderness both beautiful and treacherous. A group of Los Angeles County Park Rangers, attached to the Sheriff's Department, were making their way through Dark Canyon. The name alone captured the foreboding atmosphere of the place. Dense vegetation clawed at narrow trails, rattlesnakes lurked under rocks, and the steep drops made each step a negotiation with gravity. It was the kind of terrain only the most determined hikers attempted, and even then, rarely. Around midday, as the sun reached its peak and shadows began to contract beneath the trees, the Rangers noticed something that should not have been there. At the base of a tree, partly concealed by soil and leaves, was what looked like a human skull. It rested in silence, bleached by months of exposure, a grim contrast to the vibrant green that framed it. Scattered nearby were other bones, tangled among debris that appeared to have been carried down by runoff. Pieces of clothing were strewn about, faded but still recognizable as once belonging to a young woman. The site was immediately secured, and calls were made to homicide detectives. Within hours, word spread quickly up the chain of command. In a matter of minutes, what had been a quiet patrol became the most significant break in the Mitrice Richardson case since the night she vanished. For her family, the news was devastating. For nearly 12 months they had lived in a suspended state of grief, unable to mourn but unable to celebrate, grasping at the hope that Mitrice might walk through the door alive. They had entertained every possibility, that she had chosen to escape the pressures of her life and live off the grid, that she was being held against her will, or that she was traveling somewhere unknown. When confirmation came that the remains belonged to Mitrice, hope collapsed into heartbreak. The search for a living daughter was over. But the discovery did not bring the relief of closure. Instead, it opened a deeper wound, one lined with disturbing questions. Dark Canyon was not a place someone casually wandered into, certainly not at night and certainly not in the clothes Mitrice had been wearing when she was last seen. She had left the Lost Hill station in jeans, a dark t-shirt, and shoes fit for an evening at a restaurant, not a trek into a wilderness that even experienced hikers approached with caution. How then had her remains ended up nearly 8 miles from the station, in some of the most difficult terrain Malibu Canyon had to offer? The distance alone seemed daunting, but the conditions made the idea nearly impossible to imagine. Equally troubling was the condition of the remains. The skull was found uphill from the rest of the bones, suggesting that time, animals, or weather had disturbed the original site. Her clothing was not intact but scattered, another sign of possible disturbance. Search teams had combed this very canyon in the months after she vanished, deploying cadaver dogs and trained volunteers. They reported nothing at the time. How had they missed what was eventually found so clearly? Had the remains been there all along, or had they somehow been placed later? When the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office was informed of the discovery, they advised waiting until forensic anthropologists could assess the scene. Yet deputies moved forward that very same day, collecting the remains before specialists could examine the site in its undisturbed state. To Mitrice's family, this decision felt like a continuation of the indifference they had accused the department of since the night she was released. The removal of the remains, they argued, compromised any chance of reconstructing exactly what had happened. And this brings us to a question for you, our viewers. If the recovery of Mitrice Richardson's remains had been handled differently, if forensic specialists had been allowed to examine the scene in its original state, do you think vital evidence might have been preserved, perhaps even revealing what truly happened in Dark Canyon? Share your thoughts in the comments. Keeping these conversations alive helps ensure cases like this are not forgotten. Her mother, Latice Sutton, expressed disbelief and fury. She had already questioned the decision to release her daughter alone that night in 2009, had already criticized the lack of urgency in the early stages of the search. Now she was faced with the possibility that the final piece of evidence, the scene of her daughter's death, had been mishandled. Her father, Michael Richardson, echoed her outrage, stating that the discovery offered no closure, only a new round of painful questions. The official word from the coroner did little to ease the family's suffering. After months of analysis, the cause of death was listed as undetermined. There were no clear signs of foul play, No bullet holes, no stabbing wounds, no obvious trauma to the bones. But advanced decomposition meant many answers were lost forever. Investigators could not prove Mitrice had been murdered, but neither could they rule it out. The canyon had stripped the truth away along with the flesh from her bones. This conclusion only heightened suspicion. If the cause of death was undetermined, then no one could say whether Mitrice had died accidentally, wandered into the canyon in a state of confusion, or been forced there by someone else. Every possibility remained on the table, each as chilling as the next. For her loved ones, undetermined was not just insufficient. It was unacceptable. Public reaction to the discovery mirrored the family's outrage. Community members who had once rallied in search parties now gathered in vigils, demanding accountability. Commentators pointed to the glaring inconsistencies: the missed searches, the removal of remains before experts arrived, and the lack of definitive forensic conclusions. Media coverage reignited, but with it came the painful recognition that Mitrice's case had never received the same relentless spotlight as other missing persons cases involving young white women. Her death became more than a personal tragedy, it became a symbol of systemic failures that extend far beyond one canyon or one department. Latice Sutton's voice carried through press conferences and interviews, cutting through the official statements with piercing clarity. She asked how her daughter could have possibly walked that distance into the canyon. She questioned why cadaver dogs had found nothing months earlier. She wanted to know why her daughter's remains were not treated with the dignity and care that any family deserves. To her, the discovery only confirmed what she had long believed, that the sheriff's department had failed Mitrice at every possible turn. The handling of the case prompted calls for an independent investigation. Activists petitioned for the FBI to step in, arguing that the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department could not be trusted to investigate itself. Community groups rallied around the Richardson family, vowing not to let Mitrice's name fade from public consciousness. And here lies the question we must ask you, our viewers. If the recovery of Mitrice Richardson's remains had been handled differently, if forensic specialists had been allowed to examine the scene in its original state, could vital evidence have been preserved? Could we know more today about what really happened in that canyon? Share your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter because without public scrutiny, cases like this risk fading into silence. Even as the bones were laid to rest, the mystery remained. The canyon had given back a body but no answers. Did Mitrice walk into that darkness on her own, guided by confusion and fatigue, or was she led there by someone with darker intentions? Why did it take nearly a year for searchers to find her, when teams had scoured those very trails? And why, after all this time, was there still no one willing to claim responsibility? By the end of 2010, the official stance was cautious and unsatisfying. Investigators said they had no evidence of homicide, but they also admitted they could not rule it out. The file remained open, suspended between accident and crime, between natural tragedy and human failure. For the Richardson family, the discovery of Mitrice's remains was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new battle, one for accountability, transparency, and justice. And for the community, it was a chilling reminder that sometimes, even when the missing are found, the truth remains out of reach. The discovery of Mitrice Richardson's remains in Dark Canyon left her family devastated, but it also set in motion a new chapter of their fight for truth and accountability. For them, the question was no longer just where Mitrice had gone, it became why the system had failed her so completely. Her release from custody, the mishandling of the investigation, and the treatment of her remains all pointed, in their eyes, to a pattern of negligence that could not be ignored. In the months that followed, Mitrice's mother, Latice Sutton, and her father, Michael Richardson, transformed their grief into action. They spoke to journalists, appeared at rallies, and gave interviews on television and radio, determined to keep Mitrice's name alive. For Latice especially, the fight was deeply personal. She had begged deputies not to release her daughter alone in the middle of the night. She had called the station hours before Mitrice vanished, only to be told everything would be fine. That reassurance now rang hollow, and she was determined to make sure no other family endured the same nightmare. Public support for the family swelled. Activists, faith leaders, and community members saw Mitrice's case as emblematic of larger systemic failures. They argued that her mental health crisis had been ignored, her safety dismissed, and her disappearance mishandled. In vigils and marches, they carried photos of Mitrice, a bright young woman with her life ahead of her, and demanded justice not only for her but for countless others whose stories had never reached the public eye. Legal action soon followed. The family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Los Angeles County, claiming that deputies had acted negligently in releasing Mitrice into the night without her phone, purse, or any way to protect herself. They highlighted the sheriff's station's failure to heed Latice's warning call, the refusal to let Mitrice stay in custody until morning, and the decision to move her remains before a coroner's forensic team could properly examine the scene. Each of these points painted a picture of indifference at best, misconduct at worst. Courtrooms became new battlegrounds. On one side were the attorneys representing the county, who argued that deputies had followed policy and bore no direct responsibility for what happened after Mitrice left the station. On the other side sat Latice and Michael, flanked by lawyers and supporters, pressing the argument that policy was meaningless if it led to preventable death. Press conferences held outside the courthouse drew cameras and microphones, with journalists asking the same questions the public wanted answered. Who failed Mitrice Richardson? And would anyone be held accountable? In 2011, the county quietly settled the lawsuit. Mitrice's parents received nearly $1 million split between them, though neither ever considered it true justice. For Latice, the money meant little compared to the hole left in her life. She described it as hush money, a way for the county to close the case without admitting fault. The settlement brought financial closure, but it left every deeper question unresolved. And here is where we want to pause and hear from you, our viewers. When a case ends in settlement but not accountability, is that justice served or justice denied? Does a payout help mend the loss, or does it silence the very voices fighting for truth? Share your thoughts in the comments. These are the kinds of questions that keep stories like Mitrice alive, and your voices matter in ensuring they are not forgotten. Despite the settlement, the push for change did not stop. Mitrice's case fueled calls for reform in how law enforcement handles individuals experiencing mental health crises. Community leaders demanded better training for deputies, clearer guidelines for release decisions, and stronger oversight of sheriff's departments. Advocates argued that no one in the throes of psychological distress should ever be released into the night without support, particularly when family members are pleading for intervention. The story also became a lens through which many examined issues of race and representation. Activists pointed out that cases involving missing black women rarely received the same national attention as those of missing white women. They argued that if Mitrice had been white, from Malibu instead of Los Angeles, her disappearance might have triggered a more urgent and thorough search from the very beginning. This disparity added to the outrage and underscored the importance of lifting up voices that might otherwise be ignored. Mitrice's parents never wavered in their pursuit of answers. Michael Richardson, her father, became a visible presence in the community, reminding people of his daughter's humanity. Latice, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to build her daughter's legacy into a platform for change. She spoke at forums, participated in awareness campaigns, and pushed for greater recognition of the challenges facing families whose loved ones vanish under suspicious circumstances. Their advocacy turned Mitrice's story from an isolated tragedy into part of a broader demand for justice. Even as years passed, the haunting image of Mitrice walking out of that sheriff's station remained seared into the public consciousness. It stood as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The failure to protect, the unwillingness to listen, the lack of accountability when it mattered most. For the family, every unanswered question was a wound that never healed. How did Mitrice end up in Dark Canyon? Was she wandering, disoriented and alone? Did she meet someone in those hills? Was there foul play, covered up by negligence or incompetence? Each theory carried pain, but none brought closure. By the mid-2010s, Mitrice Richardson's name had become a rallying cry. Documentaries revisited her case, journalists wrote retrospectives, and true crime communities on social media dissected the timeline, hoping to find what investigators could not. The story resonated because it was more than a mystery, it was a reflection of systemic flaws, the kind that could touch anyone's family if the wrong set of circumstances aligned. Through it all, Latice and Michael carried the unbearable weight of not knowing. They pushed through interviews, appearances, and campaigns, their grief visible but their determination stronger. For them, justice was not about headlines or settlements, it was about answers that never came. The years since Mitrice Richardson's disappearance and the discovery of her remains have done little to soften the doubts that hang over her story. In some ways, time has only deepened the mystery. Each anniversary is not a marker of healing, but of how fragile and incomplete the search for justice can be. Mitrice was laid to rest, but the echoes of her story continue to reverberate across California and beyond. For her family, every new year brings the same ache, the same replay of unresolved mysteries. Mitrice Sutton, her mother, often reflects not just on the night Mitrice was released from custody, but on the chain of decisions that followed. She wonders what might have been different if one deputy had listened, if one supervisor had paused, if one choice had gone another way. Michael Richardson, her father, still pushes for answers, believing that someone knows more than they have admitted. Their voices, though sometimes weary, remain a crucial part of keeping Mitrice's case alive in public memory. The Sheriff's Department, for its part, has remained largely unmoved. Official statements insist that deputies acted within policy, that Mitrice's release was lawful, that the investigation into her death found no evidence of foul play. But to the family, these statements feel like a wall, tall, unyielding, and deliberately opaque. They argue that policy should never override common sense, especially when a life is at stake. The gap between the department's stance and the family's lived experience continues to fuel outrage. Even within law enforcement circles, quiet doubts linger. Retired officers and legal experts have questioned whether the investigation was handled with the rigor it deserved. Some point to the mishandling of Mitrice's remains as a critical error, one that may have erased vital evidence forever. Others highlight the lack of transparency, suggesting that if nothing was wrong, there should have been no need for secrecy. For advocates and community leaders, Mitrice's case remains a rallying cry. It represents the intersection of race, gender, and mental health in the criminal justice system, an intersection where too many lives are lost or neglected. They argue that Mitrice's death was not simply a tragedy but a preventable outcome of systemic flaws. Her story is told at conferences on criminal justice reform, cited in discussions about missing persons disparities, and remembered in vigils held to honor Black women whose cases remain unsolved or underreported. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reports have revisited Mitrice's case over the years, each trying to shed new light on the mystery. They retrace the timeline, interview family members, and press officials for answers. Yet, the more the story is told, the more it seems to circle back to the same painful truth. The core details remain elusive. How did Mitrice end up in Dark Canyon? Was she lost and disoriented, wandering until exhaustion claimed her? Or was there someone else involved? A stranger, an acquaintance, perhaps even someone she encountered near the station that night? Without evidence, speculation fills the void. In the broader cultural conversation, Mitrice's story has also become part of the growing awareness of the missing white woman syndrome, the phenomenon in which disappearances of white women often dominate headlines while cases involving women of color struggle for visibility. Advocates point to Mitrice as a stark example. Her case was covered locally and regionally, but it never reached the fevered national pitch of others. That disparity has fueled ongoing discussions about whose stories are prioritized and why. Mitrice Sutton has often said that she tells Mitrice's story not just to honor her daughter, but to warn others. She urges families to advocate fiercely for their loved ones, to never assume the system will protect them. For her, Mitrice's case is a reminder that vigilance is essential, and that silence only benefits institutions, not the victims left behind. Over time, the canyon where Mitrice's remains were found has taken on a haunting symbolism. Dark Canyon, a rugged, isolated place difficult to navigate and easy to get lost in, has become more than just geography. For many, it represents the shadows of unresolved truths, the silence of institutions, and the barriers that prevent justice. Hikers still pass through, but for those who know Mitrice's story, the canyon will always carry a weight heavier than its name. And yet, despite the pain, there is a legacy. Mitrice Richardson is remembered not only as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. Her case has spurred calls for better mental health interventions, for reconsideration of jail release policies, and for more attention to the disparities in media coverage. Her face appears in awareness campaigns, her name invoked in advocacy for reform. In this way, she lives on, not just in the memories of those who loved her, but in the ongoing fight for a more just system. For true crime followers, Mitrice's case remains both heartbreaking and frustrating. It has all the hallmarks of a story that should have an answer: a clear timeline, multiple agencies involved, a body recovered. And yet, the final piece, the truth of what happened in those last hours of Mitrice's life, remains missing. Theories abound, but none have been proven. And so the story lingers unresolved, a puzzle forever incomplete. To this day, her mother continues to visit the place where Mitrice's remains were found, leaving flowers, saying prayers, and speaking her daughter's name aloud so that the canyon itself will remember. She refuses to let Mitrice be forgotten, even when institutions seem content to move on. That act of remembrance is powerful, because in a world that too often forgets the names of Black women lost to violence or neglect, remembering is itself an act of justice. And so we bring this story back to you, our viewers. What do you think happened to Mitrice Richardson? Was her death the result of negligence and abandonment in the middle of a mental health crisis? Or is there more hidden in the shadows of Dark Canyon? We invite you to share your thoughts, your theories, and your reflections in the comments below. These conversations matter because each time we speak her name, we resist the silence that too often surrounds cases like hers. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, and turn on notifications so you never miss updates on the cases we cover. Your engagement helps us bring these stories to light, keeping victims' names alive and their stories remembered. Together, we ensure that justice, even when delayed or denied, is never silenced.